It was a sunny afternoon when my disabled daughter, who had always been terrified of loud noises, was locked inside a cage by an HOA Karen. But this time, she wasn't the one in danger. Now, this so-called Karen is facing criminal charges, and the tables have turned in a way no one could have imagined. You won't believe how far things went, and how it all ended in a shocking twist that no one saw coming. We had just settled into our new home, a modest house in a suburban neighborhood that promised peace and tranquility. After years of moving from one place to another due to my work, I thought it was time to put down roots. The idea was simple, a fresh start for my family, especially for my daughter, who had always struggled to find stability. Moving to a quiet area seemed like the best decision we could make. My daughter was the heart of this decision. She suffers from a rare disability that affects both her mobility and her communication. Routine was everything to her. It brought a sense of control in a world that often felt unpredictable. Every day was a series of small, manageable steps to maintain that balance. From her therapy sessions to the specific arrangement of her room, every detail mattered. Our home had to be a sanctuary, a place where she could feel safe and comfortable. I didn't want any distractions or complications. The neighborhood had a reputation for being well kept, with friendly neighbors and families who seemed genuinely interested in their community's well-being. The HOA, Homeowners Association, was a key part of that image. They were the ones responsible for making sure the neighborhood stayed in line, ensuring everyone followed the rules. At first, I saw them as nothing more than a background figure, something that handled the administrative aspects of the area with little impact on our day-to-day life. What I didn't anticipate was how deeply the HOA would involve themselves in the most personal aspects of our lives. The first time I heard from them, it was a letter, nothing more than a formal welcome to the neighborhood. It detailed the HOA's responsibilities and the various rules and regulations that we would need to follow. They laid out the guidelines for everything from yard maintenance to the color of fences, but there was nothing in the letter that raised any red flags. As a family, we had no intention of causing any trouble or breaking any rules. We were just trying to live a peaceful life. But it didn't take long for things to change. My daughter's disability meant that there were certain accommodations we had to make. She had special medical equipment, and we often had physical therapy sessions at home. These sessions could sometimes cause noise, but they were essential for her well-being. She also had a therapy dog who helped her manage her anxiety and provided comfort during tough days. We tried to be considerate of our neighbors, always making sure the dog was properly trained and that the therapy sessions were scheduled during reasonable hours. The last thing we wanted was to disturb anyone. That's when I first noticed the tension. A few weeks into our move, I began to see a neighbor, an older woman, looking at our house with disapproval. She would peer through her window whenever we were out in the yard, often shaking her head. I didn't think much of it at the time. After all, some people just seemed to be naturally judgmental. But one day, she came to my door with a list of complaints. At first, I thought she was just being a nuisance, but then I realized she was representing the HOA. The first conversation was polite, though filled with condescension. She introduced herself as part of the HOA's Community Watch program. She told me that our property violated several minor rules, including the placement of medical equipment that was visible from the street, and the fact that our dog's presence might be disturbing to some neighbors. I was taken aback. These were issues that had never been raised in the letter, and I had assumed we were following the guidelines to the letter. But she was firm in her stance, and the subtle pressure she applied suggested that I might face consequences if I didn't comply with her demands. I tried to explain that my daughter's disability and medical equipment were not optional. Her needs were not something we could hide or change. I also defended the dog, who had been a vital part of her care. But my attempts to explain fell on deaf ears. The woman's tone became colder as she spoke, as though she was simply following the rules without considering the human side of the equation. I felt a knot form in my stomach, but I tried to remain calm and assured her that we would take steps to address any concerns. I never imagined that the initial seemingly innocent interaction would mark the beginning of a much larger conflict. The HOA, once a faceless entity that seemed harmless, had now become a source of stress and fear. It wasn't just the woman who had issues with us. It was the HOA as a whole. And it was clear that they would stop at nothing to enforce their rules, no matter the personal cost. Little did I know at the time, this was just the calm before the storm. The HOA, supposedly there to protect us and keep the peace, was about to make a series of decisions that would turn our lives upside down, and it would all start with something as simple as a neighbor's complaint. Our hopes for a peaceful life were quickly slipping away, but I couldn't yet see how much more dangerous things were about to get. The seemingly benign rules and regulations of the HOA were about to evolve into a weapon that would target my family in ways I never could have predicted. What started as a conversation about trivial violations would soon snowball into a nightmare I wasn't prepared for. This was no longer just about rules. It was about power, control, and the dangerous lengths people would go to when they think they can push others around. The tension between us and the HOA had been building up for weeks, but it was subtle at first. Minor complaints and small issues, none of which seemed like anything worth getting upset over. My daughter's therapy sessions, which required specific medical equipment, had been set up just outside our home in the yard a few times, as she needed sunlight and fresh air to help with her recovery. The therapy dog, trained to calm her nerves, had also been an essential part of her treatment. Yet, what seemed like harmless adjustments to her daily care quickly became a point of contention for the HOA. It all came to a head when HOA Karen, the woman who had been checking in on us, knocked on our door with a printed list of so-called violations. At first, I thought it was some sort of misunderstanding. After all, we had been following the rules as best we could. The letter from the HOA, though long and filled with legal jargon, had seemed clear enough. The medical equipment in the yard, while perhaps not ideal in terms of aesthetics, was essential for my daughter's well-being. We weren't the type to flaunt our situation or make it a public issue, but we also couldn't hide what was necessary for her care. When I opened the door and saw Karen holding a sheet of paper with a list of complaints, my initial reaction was confusion. I didn't expect it to be this serious. My mind raced through all the possible things that could have raised alarms, but nothing on that list made any sense. The first complaint was that my daughter's medical equipment was visible from the driveway. The second was about the therapy dog being too loud at times, and the third was that the setup of our yard distracted from the neighborhood's aesthetic. Each item seemed more absurd than the last, and it became clear that the HOA's concern wasn't about maintaining any real standards, but rather about enforcing an image of perfection that had no consideration for the reality of people's lives. Tried to explain in the calmest way possible that the equipment in question was vital for my daughter's daily life. I explained how we tried to be as discreet as possible with everything, how we always made sure the dog was well behaved, and how none of our neighbors had ever expressed a problem with any of it. But Karen wasn't interested in listening. Instead, she turned the conversation into a demand for immediate compliance. She said that the HOA would give us a formal notice unless we immediately corrected these violations. I could feel the pressure building up, but I still didn't believe it would escalate any further. I assumed it was a matter of misunderstanding, and that once I explained everything, we could move on. However, Karen wasn't finished. She didn't just present the violations. She threatened us with fines and said that if we didn't fix the situation within a week, the HOA would begin taking legal action. The tone in her voice, calm but firm, suggested that this was just the beginning. I began to feel the gravity of the situation. This wasn't simply about enforcing rules. It was about power, control, and the desire to dictate how my family lived, in our own home. She made it clear that if we didn't follow the rules to the letter, the HOA would punish us for every little thing they could find. The more I tried to explain, the more Karen dug in. She brushed off my concerns about my daughter's medical condition and treated it as a nuisance, something that could easily be ignored in favor of maintaining community standards. The rules, in her mind, were more important than the people they were supposed to protect. And it wasn't just about medical equipment or the therapy dog anymore. Everything about our life was now under scrutiny. I could sense the disdain in her voice as she referred to my daughter's needs as disruptive to the neighborhood. At this point, I could feel the anger bubbling inside me. I wasn't angry at the HOA's rules. After all, I understood that some order needed to be kept in a neighborhood, but I was furious at the lack of empathy, the complete disregard for what my family was going through. This wasn't a case of minor violations. This was an attack on our right to live in a way that best suited my daughter's needs. My frustration turned to disbelief when Karen threatened to call the police or even Child Protective Services if we didn't comply. That was the moment I knew things weren't just about rules anymore. This was personal. It wasn't enough that we were simply being fined or warned. Karen wanted to break us down to prove her authority at the expense of my family. The conversation became more heated. I tried to keep my voice calm, but the absurdity of it all made it difficult. We exchanged harsh words, but no matter what I said, Karen seemed determined to push her agenda. Her unwavering stance showed that this wasn't just about enforcing rules, it was about establishing dominance over us. She refused to consider any reasoning that didn't align with her view of what the neighborhood should look like. And at that moment, I realized how dangerous this could become. If she could do this over something as trivial as medical equipment, what else could she do? Karen's behavior wasn't just an isolated incident. It was a reflection of the broader culture of the HOA. They weren't interested in the well-being of the residents. They were focused on maintaining a certain image, regardless of the cost to the people living within the community. My daughters' health and comfort meant nothing in their eyes. I had thought that dealing with a simple HOA issue would be a minor inconvenience, but it had turned into a confrontation with the very people who were supposed to uphold the neighborhood's sense of order and peace. Instead, they were creating chaos in my life, threatening my family's security in the most cruel and unjust ways. I never imagined that this would be the moment when everything started to unravel, but the longer the conversation went on, the more I realized that this was only the beginning of something much larger and more dangerous than I could have anticipated. The days that followed the confrontation with the HOA Karen were tense. My mind kept racing, unable to let go of the conversation. I kept thinking about how quickly the situation had escalated. The threats, the warnings, everything had felt like a bad dream, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something much worse was looming on the horizon. Yet, I never expected what would happen next. My daughter had always been a source of joy in our home. Despite her disability, she had a remarkable ability to find peace in the smallest things. Her therapy sessions, which were meant to help her cope with her condition, often took place in the yard where she could feel the warmth of the sun on her skin and listen to the soft sounds of nature. The therapy dog was an integral part of her treatment, offering comfort and companionship during these times. The two of them had formed a bond that was nothing short of beautiful. It wasn't just a dog. It was her friend, her support, and her emotional anchor. On that particular day, my daughter was in the yard with her dog, laughing and playing as she always did. She was a bright, positive soul, and nothing made her happier than her time outdoors. It was a routine for her, one that brought her the relief she so desperately needed. Her laughter echoed through the yard as the dog ran around, and I felt a brief sense of relief. The world felt right in that moment. But little did I know, just beyond the walls of our home, things were about to take a turn for the worse. It wasn't long before I received an unexpected phone call from one of my neighbors, a woman I had never spoken to much. Her voice was panicked and urgent as she told me what had happened. I could barely comprehend the words at first, the shock of her message almost too much to process. My daughter, my precious child, had been locked in a cage. A cage, the kind of cage you would find for animals, not for people. My heart immediately dropped into my stomach, and I felt my entire world tilt. The rage and confusion hit me like a tidal wave. How could anyone, especially someone from the HOA, do something so cruel? Karen had crossed a line that could never be undone. The simple act of locking a vulnerable child in a cage was not just an act of cruelty, it was an unforgivable violation of trust, of basic human decency. To make matters worse, the reason behind it was equally appalling. Karen, in her obsession with enforcing the rules, had decided that my daughter's laughter, her playful sounds, were somehow disturbing the peace. In her twisted mind, the joy of a child with special needs was a threat to the harmony of the neighborhood. My daughter, whose condition already made life challenging enough, had been singled out and punished in the cruelest way imaginable. And for what? Because she was simply existing? Because she had the audacity to live her life on her own terms? The thought of it filled me with an overwhelming sense of injustice. How could someone who was supposed to be a representative of the community, someone tasked with keeping things peaceful, turn into the very thing that caused the most harm? As the news sank in, I tried to wrap my mind around the details. Karen must have been aware of my daughter's disability. We had never hidden it. Her medical needs were part of who she was, and anyone who spent any time near our home would have seen it. So why would Karen do this? It wasn't about enforcing rules anymore. It wasn't about making the neighborhood look pristine. This was personal. She had decided to take matters into her own hands, and she had no regard for the consequences. The sheer audacity of it left me speechless. The more I thought about it, the angrier I became. What kind of person locks a disabled child in a cage and calls it discipline or enforcement of the rules? It wasn't just a violation of HOA policies. It was an assault on my daughter's dignity, her safety, and her right to live without fear. Karen had shown no compassion, no understanding, and certainly no respect for my family. It was clear that this was no longer a simple issue of rules or regulations. What Karen had done wasn't just about enforcing HOA guidelines. It was about power. It was about someone using their position to exert control over others in the most cruel and harmful way possible. In her mind, she held all the cards, and she didn't hesitate to use that power to break a family that was already struggling. I immediately contacted the police. What had happened wasn't just an accident or a misunderstanding. It was an act of violence, plain and simple. It didn't matter that Karen had wrapped it up in the guise of enforcing neighborhood rules. The fact remained that she had endangered my daughter in the most blatant and horrifying way. My daughter wasn't just trapped in a cage physically. She had been trapped in a nightmare that no child should ever have to face. As I waited for the authorities to arrive, I couldn't help but feel a mixture of disbelief and fury. This was a woman who had seen my daughter, who knew about her condition, and still chose to lock her away as though she were some kind of animal. It didn't matter how many rules she thought were being broken. No set of regulations or guidelines could ever justify what had just happened. This was no longer about a neighborhood's rules. This was about human decency, and Karen had shown none of it. The impact of what Karen had done rippled far beyond that moment. What was meant to be a simple confrontation over minor issues had spiraled into something far darker, and now my family was at the center of a storm we never saw coming. The outrage I felt was immense, but more than anything, I was filled with a deep sense of protectiveness over my daughter. I couldn't undo what had been done, but I would do everything in my power to make sure Karen paid for what she had done, and that she never had the chance to hurt anyone else again. As soon as I called the police, a mix of relief and dread washed over me. Relief, because I knew that what had happened was wrong. And now someone with authority was finally going to take it seriously. Dread, because I knew the truth would be difficult to prove, and I feared that Karen, with all her power and authority, within the HOA, would find a way to twist the narrative in her favor. I never imagined she would stoop to playing the victim, but that's exactly what happened. Karen, when questioned by the authorities, claimed that she had simply been trying to help my daughter by locking her in the cage. According to her, she thought it was necessary to calm her down when she became too loud. The idea that she could try to justify what she had done with such a flimsy excuse was almost beyond belief. Karen seemed to believe that her position as an HOA leader, coupled with her good intentions, would shield her from any consequences. But what she didn't count on was the irrefutable evidence that was stacking up against her. First and foremost, there was the video footage. One of our neighbors, who had witnessed the entire incident from their window, had recorded the entire exchange between Karen and my daughter. The footage clearly showed Karen locking my daughter in the cage and standing there while she cried. The camera also captured Karen's cold, detached demeanor, as though she had no concept of the cruelty she was inflicting. There was no mistaking it. The video was a smoking gun, and it painted a picture of abuse that no one could ignore. But the video wasn't the only piece of evidence. Several other neighbors, who had also witnessed the incident or had seen the aftermath, came forward with statements. One neighbor, a retired nurse, described how she had seen my daughter in distress as she was removed from the cage, and how Karen had refused to let anyone help her. Another neighbor, a local teacher, recalled seeing Karen dragging my daughter by the arm, ignoring her pleas to be let out. Each of these witnesses painted a picture of Karen as someone who was not just enforcing rules, but taking matters into her own hands in a callous and dangerous way. In addition to the testimonies from the neighbors, we also had the professional report from my daughter's therapist, who had been working with her for several months. The therapist had been deeply concerned about the effects that such an incident could have on my daughter's mental and emotional well-being. In the report, the therapist described how my daughter's disability required careful handling and the importance of ensuring she felt safe and secure at all times. The therapist specifically noted that locking a disabled child in a cage could cause severe emotional trauma and worsen her condition, potentially undoing months of hard work in her treatment. The report was a vital piece of evidence that not only corroborated our claims, but also highlighted the severity of what Karen had done. Despite Karen's attempts to play the victim and downplay her actions, the weight of the evidence against her was undeniable. The police investigation moved swiftly from there, and it quickly became clear that Karen's version of events was nothing more than a fabrication designed to cover up her cruelty. Her attempts to justify her actions by claiming she was trying to help rang hollow in light of the facts. The more Karen spoke, the more she dug herself into a hole, and the more her lies became apparent. Within a matter of days, the investigation progressed to the point where criminal charges were being discussed. The police charged Karen with child endangerment and false imprisonment. These charges were a direct result of her actions, and they carried significant legal consequences. The fact that she had locked my daughter in a cage, knowing full well that my daughter had a disability and that her safety and well-being required careful attention, was a violation of basic human rights. The charge of false imprisonment stemmed from the fact that Karen had confined my daughter against her will without any legal or moral justification. As the investigation continued, the pressure on Karen increased. She couldn't hide behind the facade of authority any longer. The truth had come to light, and there was no way to escape the reality of what she had done. The community began to turn on her as well. Neighbors who had previously been too afraid to speak out against the HOA now saw Karen for what she truly was, a person willing to use her position to harm others. Her actions had shattered the illusion of the HOA as a benevolent force in the community. People started to ask themselves how someone like Karen could have been allowed to hold any power in the first place. For me, the investigation was both a relief and a constant reminder of the deep pain that Karen had caused. The emotional toll on my family, particularly on my daughter, was something that would take time to heal. My daughter, once so full of life and optimism, was now struggling with trust issues, unsure of who to turn to or whether she would ever feel safe again. The damage that had been done was not just physical. It was psychological, and it was something we would have to work through together. While Karen's legal troubles continued to mount, I couldn't help but feel a sense of justice beginning to take shape. What she had done to my daughter was unforgivable, but seeing the truth emerge, seeing her face consequences for her actions, brought a sense of closure. This wasn't just about holding Karen accountable. It was about sending a message that no one, no matter how powerful or influential, was above the law. The investigation had proved that truth and justice would prevail, even when the people in charge thought they could act without consequence. As the police prepared their case against Karen, I knew there would still be a long road ahead. The emotional scars on my daughter would take time to heal, but we were one step closer to ensuring that Karen could never harm anyone again. The investigation had given us hope that, in the end, justice would be served. As the case against Karen gained momentum, something unexpected began to surface. The more the investigation dug into her past, the clearer it became that this wasn't just an isolated incident. Karen wasn't some rogue member of the HOA who'd lost control in a moment of anger. She was a calculated, manipulative individual who had been using her position to create havoc in the neighborhood for years. The truth that came to light was shocking, and it made everything I had experienced feel like just the tip of the iceberg. It turned out that Karen had a long history of abusing her authority within the HOA. She had been manipulating the rules to her advantage for years, constantly finding ways to bully and harass residents. Karen wasn't just someone enforcing rules. She was using her power to intimidate anyone who dared to question her. Over the years, multiple families had come forward with complaints, but they were always silenced by her influence within the community. She had built a reputation as someone who couldn't be challenged, and anyone who spoke up was quickly dismissed or ostracized. This was not the first time she had crossed the line. In fact, Karen had a record full of harassment cases, many of them involving families with young children or disabled individuals, just like mine. These cases had never gone public because Karen had always managed to bury them, using the HOA's resources to defend herself and using her power to silence anyone who dared to raise concerns. The neighbors I spoke with in the aftermath of what happened to my daughter shared stories of their own encounters with Karen, detailing how she would exploit her position to create a climate of fear and control. People who had dared to question her authority were often fined for the smallest infractions, while she turned a blind eye to others who were violating the very rules she claimed to enforce. What made this even more disturbing was the revelation that Karen had been targeting vulnerable individuals and families. She had a pattern of picking out those who were easier to control or intimidate, those who didn't have the power to fight back. The more I learned, the angrier I became, realizing that my family wasn't the only one to suffer at her hands. The sense of injustice deepened, knowing that Karen had been wreaking havoc for so long, unchecked and unchallenged. But it wasn't until the authorities unearthed her past that the full scope of her abuse came to light. What had initially felt like a personal attack on my family quickly became a much larger story, one that exposed Karen for the manipulative, power-hungry individual she truly was. As the investigation went on, more neighbors came forward, and their stories echoed the same pattern. Karen's cruelty wasn't just isolated to my daughter. It had been directed at countless others, and her manipulation of the HOA's rules had left a wake of fear and suffering in its path. The once solid support that Karen had enjoyed within the community quickly began to crumble. People who had previously been too afraid to speak out or had felt powerless to challenge her finally found their voices. They came forward with their own stories of mistreatment, of rules being twisted to punish them for minor offenses, while Karen and her allies were allowed to operate without consequence. The community that had once rallied behind her in fear now began to turn against her, as they realized just how far she had gone to protect her power. The same HOA that had allowed her to reign unchecked for so long now found itself facing an internal crisis, with many of its members questioning how they had let her abuse her position for so long. In the midst of all of this, Karen's carefully constructed image as the neighborhood's enforcer of justice fell apart. She was no longer seen as the well-intentioned figure who simply wanted to make the neighborhood a better place. She was exposed as someone who had used her position to terrorize the people she was supposed to protect. And with this truth came consequences. The HOA, under increasing pressure from the community and local authorities, was forced to distance itself from Karen. The very organization that had allowed her to run roughshod over the neighborhood now had to face the fallout of her actions. The authorities were not the only ones closing in on Karen. The media caught wind of the story, and the once untouchable Karen quickly became the subject of news reports, her name splashed across headlines. The story of how a powerful HOA leader had locked a disabled child in a cage was one that drew widespread outrage, and it wasn't long before the community demanded justice. What started as a personal vendetta against one family had spiraled into a public scandal that threatened to tear apart the HOA's reputation and the community's trust in its leadership. For Karen, the consequences of her actions were inevitable. The criminal charges, which had initially seemed like a small part of the larger picture, now became the least of her problems. She had spent years operating behind the shield of the HOA, using it as a weapon to protect herself and silence her critics. But now, with the truth out in the open, she was facing not only the legal ramifications of her abuse, but also the complete collapse of her influence. Her career within the HOA was over, and her reputation in the community was shattered beyond repair. Karen was no longer the feared HOA enforcer. She was a pariah, someone who had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. And yet, for me, the story wasn't just about seeing Karen face the consequences of her actions. It was about the wake-up call that this entire ordeal had provided. It made me realize just how easy it is for people in positions of power to manipulate systems and prey on the vulnerable. Karen wasn't just an isolated case of one person gone rogue. She was part of a larger system of corruption and abuse. Her story was a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked power and the lengths people will go to in order to maintain control. This experience had opened my eyes to the fragile nature of trust in a community and the importance of holding those in power accountable for their actions. In the end, Karen's downfall wasn't just about seeing her face criminal charges or losing her position in the HOA. It was about the broader realization that power, when left unchecked, can easily be abused. The story of what happened to my family and the unraveling of Karen's reign of terror became a rallying cry for others who had suffered in silence for far too long. And while Karen would ultimately face the consequences of her actions, it was the community's courage to stand up to her that truly marked the end of her tyrannical rule. If you want to hear more jaw-dropping HOA stories and stay updated on the latest drama, subscribe to the HOA Stories now.